Ahead of his recovery process the entire time, Jordyn Brooks is back in action for the Seahawks. We're going to be breaking down the importance of number 56 returning to their defense in the middle of training camp coming up next on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined for our Wednesday episode by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening in Salt Lake City, Utah, or Mumbai, India. We greatly appreciate you making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We're drawing ever closer to the second preseason game coming up against the Dallas Cowboys on Saturday, but still several days of practice work to get in before the Seahawks take the field for their second preseason game. We're going to be breaking down where things stand in 3 different competitions on defense midway through training camp. And then we're going to shift gears to our latest updated 53-man roster projections on the defensive side of the football. Without further ado, let's get to it. Now for your lead story here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. When Jordyn Brooks suffered a torn ACL on New Year's Day, January 1st this year, many expected that he was going to miss the start of the 2023 season coming back from such a severe injury. And yet here we are, August 16th. And Jordyn Brooks has been activated from the PUP list. He has passed his physical less than 8 months after his surgery, Rob. He had surgery on January 19th. This is an injury even in today's, with today's medicine and the changes we've made technology-wise with surgeries. Normally, this is a 9 to 10 month minimum rehab. And yet Jordyn Brooks, less than 8 months, he is on the field. He has passed his physical. It is a remarkable recovery. And this has a chance to be a real game changer for the Seahawks because there's a little less than 4 weeks until the season opener. That's plenty of time to get him back into football shape to be ready to play against the Rams in the season opener.
Corbin, this is huge news for the Seahawks. I mean, we talked about this just a couple of days ago when we were joined by Sean, and you, I think, very accurately pointed out your concerns at the depth of inside linebacker. So to get Jordyn Brooks, who, oh, by the way, is just a couple of years removed from setting the Seahawks franchise record for the most tackles in a season, to potentially be able to get him back onto the field by the time that the Seahawks start their regular season would be, as you said it, remarkable. It really is an extraordinary recovery from Jordyn Brooks. It is a testament to his work ethic, a testament to his athleticism, and certainly a testament to, the improved medical technology and recovery plans by today's athletes. But again, to me, what is one of the most impressive things about this is we're talking about a linebacker whose entire game is built on his speed and his ability to change direction. So for the Seahawks to feel comfortable enough to pass him in his physical is a huge, huge move for this club. And I think that, clearly Bobby Wagner is going to be, one of the headliners for the Seahawks, but they want to have Jordyn Brooks back. I was as impressed as I could be with what we saw from Devin Bush in the preseason opener. But again, this is massive news for the Seahawks, and I think it is a huge, huge step for them being able to compete for real when it comes to, looking for a playoff spot and perhaps even deep into the playoffs.
Yeah, you mentioned Devin Bush, and I want to make it clear here that with Jordyn Brooks coming back, this does not mean that he is suddenly going to be thrown back into the starting lineup at practice and doing all the team drills. They're going to be doing what they've been doing with Reek Woolen and some of the other players coming off injury. They are going to continue easing him back in. In fact, Tuesday, he did not participate in practice, even though he was activated from the PUP list. They still had him doing workouts with Jamal Adams beforehand, and I'm sure he was doing the walkthrough stuff as he has been doing. But to get him back at any capacity at this stage, less than 8 months after surgery, it is a phenomenal. This is an Adrian Peterson type recovery. Now, The Seahawks can only hope that Jordyn Brooks has a season like Adrian Peterson had coming off of that torn ACL when he rushed for over 2,000 yards. If they can have that kind of a season on defense from Jordyn Brooks to go with Bobby Wagner, that is going to instantly make this a much better defense than the one we saw a year ago, particularly against the run. So it's a big deal, but having Devin Bush there does give you the flexibility where you can have him off the PUP list, but you don't necessarily have to say, hey, by week 1, we have to force the issue. Let's get him ready to play. You don't have to. This says that they expect he's going to be ready to play in the first 4 games. Otherwise, they would have kept him on the PUP list. But if they want to ease him back in, maybe he plays a handful of snaps in the first couple regular season games just to get his feet back underneath him. And Devin Bush is a guy that has started a lot of games in the NFL, a former top 10 pick. So it does give you a lot of flexibility there where you don't necessarily have to force the issue. And that leads me to Jamal Adams, because even though Adams has not been activated yet, from everything Pete Carroll said, everything I've been told, Jordyn Brooks and Jamal Adams basically have been neck and neck when it comes to getting back on the field. I've got to believe at this point that number 33 is very close to having his name activated to the roster off of the PUP list, which would obviously be a big deal as well. But it's nice to see the timing here, because Seattle knew that the team didn't have to rush, especially with Julian Love and Devin Bush being added in free agency. They didn't have to force these guys back in, but to get them back in the middle of August with plenty of time to gear them up for the regular season, making sure these guys were 100% ready to go, it is a big deal on all fronts.
No, it absolutely is. And again, we had some concerns about the depth at the inside linebacker position. And so there's dominoes that could fall here with, Jordyn Brooks being able to return to the team. Whereas the depth at safety, I feel like, is strong enough that Seattle, I think has a little bit more flexibility at that position. Jamal Adams, of course, is coming from a not that necessarily more significant injury, but a more unusual injury. And so the recovery time is going to be a little bit more up in the air. And just like we talked about with Jordyn Brooks and how he plays a position where it's critical that you have speed and change of direction, obviously that's even more the case at the safety position. So yes, Godspeed to Jamal Adams and his recovery. I hope that he is going to be clear his physical here soon and be back on Seattle's active roster. That's obviously the hope. Number 33 is a dynamic talent, but at the same time, I caution getting too excited about Jamal Adams, just because I do think that the Seahawks have a little bit more flexibility. They may not be in quite as much of a rush to get him back onto the field as they did with Jordyn Brooks.
In other injury news, this is off of yesterday's show. We were talking about that 4th receiver position. Drake Young was back in pads and practiced yesterday. So that is a really good development for Seattle with a young receiver that the coaching staff is really excited about. And now he's going to have a chance to still compete for that number 4 receiving spot and maybe a bit more of a significant role in this offense. It's good news that it looks like he avoided the sports hernia, at least for now, knocking him out of practice for a prolonged period of time. Cody Thompson was also back on the field. That one was not as surprising because probably could have played if it was a regular season game last Thursday, but Seattle opted to hold him out with a tight groin. So both those guys back in the practice field. The competition is truly on at the receiver position. Speaking of competitions, we're going to go over to defense. Today's going to be a very defensive-centric episode. We're going to be taking a look at 3 competitions that are still ongoing on the defensive side of the football and where things stand, maybe changing a few predictions from pre-training camp. We'll have to wait and see on that front, but we're going to get to those competitions coming up next year on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks, which is brought your way by Nutrafol. Men think losing their hair is inevitable. You don't have to choose between better hair growth and your health. Nutrafol provides a whole-body health approach for men that promotes healthier hair, no drugs, no compromises, just better hair. You don't have to choose between better hair growth and your health. Nutrafol provides a whole-body health approach for men that promotes healthier hair. Men think losing their hair is inevitable. Take control of your hair's future with Nutrafol's science-backed hair growth supplement for men. Did you know that 80% of men will experience hair thinning in their lifetime? It's normal, but it doesn't have to be your fate. You can get ahead of thinning with Nutrafol. Take the first step to visibly thicker, healthier hair. For a limited time, Nutrafol is offering our listeners $10 off your first month subscription and free shipping when you go to Nutrafol.com/men and enter the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. Find out why over 4,000 healthcare professionals recommend Nutrafol for healthier hair. Nutrafol.com/men, spelled Nutrafol.com/men, and enter promo code LOCKEDONNFL. That's Nutrafol.com/men, promo code LOCKEDONNFL. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Coming up on tomorrow's show, going to have some takeaways coming out of the final open training camp practice of the 2023 season, plus what to watch on offense when the Seahawks take on the Cowboys at Lumen Field in the second preseason game on Saturday. Make sure you're listening in. You won't want to miss it. Let's get back to competition, shall we? It is the pinnacle of Pete Carroll's philosophy as coach of the Seahawks, and there are plenty of competitions still taking place on the defensive side of the football, including at the cornerback position. Who is going to start opposite of Reek Woolen? Devin Witherspoon is still sidelined by a hamstring injury, so his opportunity to maybe throw his hat into the ring on the outside, at least for now, looks like it needs to be put on the back burner. That means Mike Jackson and Trey Brown are still the two that are competing for that left cornerback spot. And after last week's preseason game, Rob, I don't know that we got any clarity on this position. Trey Brown made a nice play with a pass breakup, but he also gave up a touchdown and missed a really bad tackle on fourth down that led to a new set of down for the Vikings. And Mike Jackson, he just kind of had one of those average games. He was out there, didn't give up any catches, but no notable plays either. So you're looking for that guy to create separation. And I'm not sure that has happened. It's kind of like the center position where you got two guys going back and forth. I don't know that there's been one player that's really seized this position to start in week one opposite of Woolen.
Yeah, Corbin, I love that you mentioned the center position when you're talking about the cornerbacks, because, I mean, hey, you got two positions, of course, that couldn't be more physically different, but I think the competition is essentially very similar. You have the kind of vested veteran here in Mike Jackson, and it's kind of like ho-hum doesn't give up a catch, kind of a thing with Evan Brown. I thought played pretty darn well for his first game action as a member of the Seattle Seahawks, but you see the flashes from Oluwatimi at the center position. You certainly see the flashes from Trey Brown as well. For my money, I still am going to go with the vested veteran at this point with Mike Jackson. I've been a big fan of his going back to the University of Miami, and I just was not surprised, but still pleased with the way that he performed for the Seahawks a year ago. And Pete Carroll has been kind of talking about it, raving about Mike Jackson basically all throughout training camp process. And so I see no reason to make any type of changes to the prediction I made before. I think that Mike Jackson is going to be the starter at the outside opposite Reek Woolen. I think that it's a good problem for the Seahawks to have. As I mentioned this before, I really think that Seattle's cornerback, as well as its safety depth, to me, is really one of the true strengths of this club. It is one of the hallmarks of Pete Carroll's tenure, is that the man just knows how to coach up the secondary. It's remarkable, the success that he's had there. And so, again, I feel confident that Trey Brown could be a starter. I certainly feel confident that the number 5 overall pick, Devin Witherspoon, is going to be a starter in the future. But I think for right now, Mike Jackson is the likely candidate to start opposite Reek Woolen when the Seahawks face off against the Los Angeles Rams in week 1.
You and I are on the same tangent here. I think Mike Jackson is going to be the starter in week 1 because I think when you put everything together, Trey Brown has had an excellent training camp.
Yes, he has.
But we've seen a full year of starting from Mike Jackson. I felt like he played at a high level. And unfortunately, because Trey Brown got hurt his rookie year and then missed most of last season, we haven't gotten to see that. So there's less of a sample size. And I feel like Mike Jackson, as well as Trey Brown, has played in camp. I think from start to now, from a complete holistic approach, I think Mike Jackson has been the more consistent player. And his battles that he's had with DK Metcalf out there on the practice field have been legendary for training camp. It's, as I've said it before, it's get your popcorn ready reps when those guys are going against each other. And that's the kind of guy you want starting for you. You want a player that is tested and has to have iron sharpen iron by going against guys like DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. So I think Mike Jackson is the starter on the outside, and I wouldn't be shocked if this is a full year thing. The Seahawks may have Devin Witherspoon playing a ton of snaps as a nickel corner, but I think Mike Jackson has done too much to keep off the field. And last week, it was kind of one of those hit and miss things. Like I said, he didn't have like a special game or anything in the preseason, but Trey Brown didn't help himself with very little margin for error in this competition with a couple of big mistakes in that preseason game. Now let's go to the trenches and talk edge rushers. And I believe it was only a few weeks ago, Rob, that you and I were both having this discussion on the show, and Darrell Taylor was working with the starters early in training camp. He gets the injury to his shoulder, still is not back on the field yet. Pete Carroll keeps saying he's making good progress, but we haven't seen him out there yet. And while this has been going on, Boye Mafe, all he's done is dominate in practice, in the mock game, in the preseason game. He got my game ball on defense. He was extremely disruptive in his couple drives that he played in that game. Mafe just keeps stepping forward, and there's still people out there that expect that Darrell Taylor is going to get the opportunity to start when he returns. I am not one of those people, though. I think that Boye Mafe at this point, and I was already leaning this way a few weeks ago before Darrell Taylor got hurt. We were talking about this, and I thought Mafe had a chance to be the starter just because I trust him more as a run defender. I think he's more reliable overall than what Darrell Taylor is, and Taylor as a situational rusher, I think can be an outstanding weapon for you. I just don't know at this point that I see a starter in this defense. Whereas Boye Mafe, I think there is an incredibly high ceiling there for a guy that is still a raw player, but he's made some big leaps this preseason and training camp.
He's made massive leaps, Corbin. I mean, that's the thing, is that you were 100% correct, at least in my opinion, in that you were saying before that Boye Mafe was going to be the starter opposite Uchenna Nwosu. And I have come to the conclusion that you were correct in that. I mean, Darrell Taylor, I still believe, is going to wind up leading the Seahawks in sacks in 2023. However, the fact that he has struggled with durability, he has struggled, as we know, in run support, to start, that obviously means first down. You have to be able to be a more consistent all-around player, not just a pass rusher. So yes, I agree. I've changed my tune in this regard, and that I do believe that Boye Mafe has overtaken Darrell Taylor to be the favorite to start outside, and that Darrell Taylor, again, assuming he is able to come back from this latest injury, is going to be able to be a very productive player for the Seahawks. But I think in terms of just who gets the start, I think the Uchenna Nwosu has ascended, whereas Darrell Taylor is basically flatlining at this point. And so while I have gone with the incumbent over and over again, I think the Boye Mafe is absolutely kind of a rising star right now. Certainly, and this is not just your and my opinion, this is what Pete Carroll has been saying. So I think that is the way that we have to go at this point. And then again, Darrell Taylor is going to be a very productive player. Similarly, we talked about the cornerback position, but I think the Boye Mafe just gives you the more well-rounded game plus upside that Darrell Taylor just has teased but not shown consistently.
You mentioned early in your show, and we were talking about Jamal Adams and the fact that it looks like he is getting close to being like Jordyn Brooks and he gets activated from the PUP list, but that the Seahawks might not be as inclined to rush him back as quickly because of the depth that they have at safety. And I think that the competition that we are seeing take place there, Joey Blount is still not back at practice. So maybe that opens the door for both of these players to be on the roster. But because we like to live with absolutes here on Locked On Seahawks, we're going to put Jarek Reed II, the 6th-round pick, up against Jonathan Sutherland, the undrafted rookie out of Penn State. Two different style players in most regards, but they are both potentially battling for one spot as a backup safety. And before the offseason started, before training camp, I think most people wouldn't have expected this to be a competition. Sutherland was a player that wasn't getting looked at as a trendy pick of the undrafted free agents to push for a roster spot. And yet here we are in mid-August, and Pete Carroll's been raving about him. He's been coaching him up one-on-one on the practice field regularly. That seems to me like a pretty good sign that Pete Carroll and the coaching staff, they love the instincts that this kid brings, the leadership, 4-time captain at Penn State. And then Jarek Reed kind of had a little bit of a shaky start to his first training camp, but I thought he played really well in the preseason game last week against the Vikings. So you've got two different players that are both looking like they are trending now in the right direction. And if they're competing for one spot, this really can be a tricky decision trying to figure out who's going to be on the team and who isn't.
Yeah, if they are competing for one spot, then it is going to be a tricky decision. But I think that this is such a deep spot at safety that Seattle has to figure out a way to keeping both of these players, in my opinion. I think at minimum, these are practice squad candidates, which of course would mean that you have to cut the player. And then if some other NFL team out there is willing to sign him to their active roster, then that leaves the Seahawks vulnerable. But I see legitimate NFL players with both Reed, who the Seahawks drafted, and therefore should have in a higher regard than Sutherland, who, in my opinion, has been the most impressive player of Seattle's undrafted free agents this year. And that includes Jake Bobo. I was not one of those who thought that Sutherland was going to be able to make this roster beforehand. But what I've seen at training camp, what I saw in that preseason opener against the Minnesota Vikings on defense as well as on special teams has 100% convinced me that Sutherland makes this squad. I really think that his physicality, his instincts, the fact, and Sean mentioned a couple of days ago, almost Jamal Adams light, I think was the way that he put it. In the way that they used him up in the box, the force that he showed, the physicality in the run, and just the instincts. So I kind of go back to the special teams play. The one we might remember that, Seahawks had this for a second. It looked like it was going to be a touchdown, off of a muff punt. And there were 3 or 4 Seahawks who were in position to get the ball off of that muff punt. What I was so impressed by with Sutherland is the fact that he hit the only Minnesota Vikings player that had any opportunity to get the ball, freeing up his teammates. That's such an instinctive physical play that I think that the Seahawks are going to absolutely love about Sutherland. And we talked about before Jake Bobo and how he was able to make that toe tap and bounce the ball back. I think it was Sutherland actually who got his toe over the line, but still the fact that he was in position to do so, to me, speaks again to his ability on special teams as well as on defense. So for my money, if the Seahawks have to choose between one or the other, I'm going with Sutherland, and I certainly did not expect to be saying that. I have a lot of respect for Jarek Reed, his story and his game, and you're right, they are different players. But I think if the Seahawks are taking it or are going to use one of these young safeties, it's going to be because they have some concerns about Jamal Adams and his ability to stay healthy. So therefore, take the player whose skill set most matches what number 33 brings to the table.
And that's the Ryan Neal element in play, because that's who I see when I watch this kid play. He had 2 pressures off blitzes on Thursday night, and they were moving him around in the box quite a bit. That's what he did at Penn State. He is more like a Ryan Neal, or as Sean said, a Jamal Adams light, a type of player that is going to play more in the box, not necessarily a deep safety, although he has shown more versatility than I anticipated we were going to see in training camp in the preseason. That is why I've got Jarek Reed, if I had to pick between these two, as my pick, though, because Jarek Reed is a legitimate athlete to play the slot cornerback position. Sutherland is not. And I feel like Julian Love, with his ability to play up in the box, Joey Blunt has shown in training camp that he can play up in the box, and he is an outstanding special teams player. I just feel like Jarek Reed brings some athleticism and ability to play some of the other positions in the secondary that you're not going to get from Sutherland or some of these other players. And I think he is still a guy that can be a waiting in the wings guy to develop behind Quandre Diggs because of his ball skills, his athleticism. We're talking about a low 4.4 speed guy that can fly all over the field. So this is tough. I mean, I really like both players. I think both players have played well enough to be on this roster. But if I had to pick between the two, the type of versatility and the athleticism he brings, I'd be leaning towards Jarek Reed II. And it's a perfect segue into our last segment, because now we're going to talk about the 53-man roster on the defensive side of the football. And yesterday, you and I had quite a few differences when we looked at the offensive depth chart. And I have a feeling that that is going to continue here, because especially on defense, there are more positions where it feels like there might be some more question marks about who makes this team. Is there going to be an undrafted free agent that's going to push his way in? There's a couple position groups that you can make that argument about. So let's talk that 53-man roster projection after the first preseason game on defense. And Rob, I'm going to give you the mic first, as always, to dish out your latest 53 projection on defense.
Yeah, so I think if you look, you mentioned undrafted free agents. And of course, the Seahawks have as fantastic of a history of that as just about any club in the league. And if you're able to see it on YouTube, then you can see this for yourself. But I'll just kind of I guess just spoil the surprise and just tell you that I've got several undrafted free agents, three. One along the defensive line, in Jake Sykes, the undrafted free agent from UCLA, who I've just been very impressed with his ability to be a penetrator. To me, he is a very similar player as Miles Adams, as Draymond Jones, and I think that it's hard to find those penetrators on the interior of the defensive line. So to me, he is one of the undrafted free agents that I have making this club. On the outside, I have the kind of the preseason darling that is Levi Bell at the outside linebacker position. And, it's another player that kind of like Jonathan Sutherland, another undrafted free agent that I have making Seattle's roster outright. But with Levi Bell, I had to be convinced, because when you see him in person, you can acknowledge the physicality, the physique that he possesses, even though he is very much a sawed-off player, basically 6 foot. But still, the fact is that he is a disruptive presence. And if the Seahawks are going to be as successful as I think that they're going to be, have the explosive offense, there's going to be some games where they should have a fairly comfortable lead. We saw it in the preseason opener against the Minnesota Vikings. And you'd love to be able to just unleash a pass rusher like Levi Bell, who has quickness, he has some lateral agility, he has better power than you might think, considering his height. Leverage is always a huge advantage in that way, as is just raw strength. So to me, those are the 3 players that I know is going to be a little bit of a surprise to some out there, because that means that there's going to be some more recognizable names that are not going to make the roster, at least the way I have it right now. As I mentioned before in yesterday's show, Corbin, with the Dallas Cowboys coming up, one of the most physically gifted teams that I've seen so far in my training camp kind of tours so far. I really think that this is going to be an interesting game for a player like a Levi Bell, for example. How is he able to perform against that huge Dallas defensive line? If he is rendered moot in that game, then I think that we might have to change this here. And this is very much an ongoing process. But right now, I think that Levi Bell, Jacob Sykes, Jonathan Sutherland, 3 undrafted free agents after the Seahawks only kept 1 a year ago, which 2, I believe it was a year ago, but the only one who lasted the entire roster or the entire team was Joey Blount. I think that it would be interesting to see Seattle go young yet again on the defensive side of the football.
Yeah, I agree with you on one of those players, and it pains me that I don't have all 3 of them on the roster, because I think all of them are 53-man roster capable players. And I know we've only seen 1 preseason game, but I'm basing that off of my training camp practices that I've gotten to watch as well. But Jacob Sykes, ironically, if you would have asked me a week ago about this, he would not have been on my radar to make this football team. But then I started looking back at my notes at training camp practices, and there's just something that was jumping out about Jacob Sykes, and it was the athleticism for one thing. This guy's an elite athlete at 280 pounds. He tests extremely well. And then you also have to account for the smarts. I mean, the guy has a degree from Harvard. So you got a great athlete who's incredibly smart. I mean, Pete Carroll is showing right now with like Jonathan Sutherland, the instincts are what he keeps bringing up with Jonathan Sutherland. Jacob Sykes, you can see those instincts too. That game last week against the Vikings had a pressure rate north of 20% from the interior, had 4 pressures, had a quarterback hit. He was all over the place in the backfield. You add the athleticism and instincts package together, and you can compensate for the fact you're only 280 pounds. If you can move and you're really smart and you play sound technique, that's maybe what I was most impressed by. That year going to UCLA really helped Jacob Sykes with his technique, and you could see it in the preseason game. Now, I need to see it again. Like you said with Levi Bell, I need to see that multiple preseason games before I'm fully going to commit here. But on this projection, I think Jacob Sykes has a great chance to make this football team. Levi Bell was the hardest one for me to omit, because anybody that's been listening to this show knows how excited I've been about him, and I want him on this roster. The issue is, do you hold 6 pass rushers on your opening day roster? I'm just not sure they're going to be ready to move on from Tyreek Smith yet at this point. There still are enough flashy plays from the former 5th-round pick that I have a feeling they're going to keep him around. So it really came down to, do I want to hold an extra linebacker? Do I want to hold an extra safety? Even with Jordyn Brooks coming back, I still think John Radigan is a special teams player and just insurance, because Brooks is still coming back from ACL. Devin Bush has had some issues the last couple of years coming off an ACL injury. you like to have depth at that position. And even though I don't think Radigan played well last Thursday, I still think that he makes sense, especially with Vi Jones likely starting the year on IR because of an ankle sprain that Pete Carroll used the dreaded legit label for. So I have John Radigan making the team over Levi Bell just because I'm looking at an insurance policy standpoint at linebacker. But if Jordyn Brooks is able to show here in the next few weeks that he's fully back, he's ready to go, I may very well change my tune on that and say, you know what? We like the three main linebackers we got. I want another dude that can get the quarterback, and that would bring Levi Bell into the equation. And as for safety, I did have that dilemma, Jarek Reed versus Jonathan Sutherland. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, I'm choosing athleticism and a different type of versatility between those two. I want the guy that can play slot corner, can play both safety positions, can drop back deep, can play in the box. I just don't know that Jonathan Sutherland has that kind of versatility, is more of a box player. And I feel like that guy that can really play those stretch secondary positions is more valuable in the NFL right now.
No, I 100% agree with you. I think you make excellent points. And it's one of the things that, again, where we have a little bit of difference is that you have several nose tackles. Brian Monet, of course, is a PUP candidate or IR, and the same thing with Austin Faulu. I almost wonder if this is a little bit like the wide receiver position we saw in the 2022 season, where there was a whole bunch of bodies that were solid players, but weren't necessarily dominant players. And it surprised some people when Seattle didn't keep quite as many wide receivers as they normally did. Well, I almost wonder if that might be the same exact situation here at the nose tackle position. Believe me, I am one of those who has very much been kind of pounding the table that Seattle had to address the interior of the defensive line. Of course, they drafted Cameron Young. They bring in Jordyn Reed. They have some big, powerful bodies there already. They've been having basically a rotation between some of these undrafted free agent rookies here that they've had in training camp. I almost wonder if Seattle is trying to create a whole group of players that they basically can call up and say, hey, we need you. We've had an injury, but not necessarily keep them on their active roster. So I only have the top two nose tackles, Jordyn Reed again, and Cameron Young, as making this squad, and the other defensive linemen being a little bit more of those penetrating types. And so that's one of the areas in which your roster and my roster, at least the projections that we have right now, is a little bit different. Otherwise, I think that we're seeing things very, very similarly. And one final note, as far as the inside linebacker position, a couple of days ago, you mentioned the name Patrick O'Connell, another undrafted free agent, this one out of Montana. And, I could see it. John Radigan did have his struggles against the Minnesota Vikings, as you accurately pointed out after watching all 22 tape. I almost wonder if Patrick O'Connell isn't very much in this mix as well. Again, with all due respect to Jordyn Brooks and his recovery, it's absolutely phenomenal news, as we talked about before. But if the Seahawks do feel that they need some youth at that linebacker position, Patrick O'Connell, I think, is very much going to be in that conversation along with John Radigan, along with BBK, to possibly make this squad as well.
Yeah, I considered all three of those guys for that final linebacker spot just because I felt like John Radigan opened the door for them. And I know he had a lot of tackles. There were some good plays, but there were a ton of missed tackles. I counted 4. And here's the thing. There's subjectivity to missed tackles.
Sure.
For me, I include poor pursuit angles as part of that. And I know that not everybody does that, but there was a play where he dove for the running back, and the running back was already all the way over the sideline. He missed him by 4 feet. And I understand you haven't been tackling at practice, but like those are the kind of plays I'm looking at. Like if he has to play for us on defense, we're in trouble. And I like John Radigan, and I think he could come back and play much better this week. I hope he does. But I'm just basing my selection of him on this 53-man roster off the fact that we have seen him play at a high level before, and he's been a very good special teams player, and he's a very heady player. You know that he's going to be able to step in from a football intelligence standpoint. He's going to be able to step in and handle duties if he has to, but this is a very wide open position. And I kind of feel that way about the safety spot for different reasons. Linebacker, I have reservations because are these guys good enough to play on Sundays? In the safety positions we've talked about so much, it's all these guys can play on Sundays. I just can't keep all of them. So which one do I want to have on the roster? And again, it comes back to preference. And I just feel like the way that the Seahawks are running their defense right now, when you have guys like Kobe Bryant that can play outside corner, slot corner, now they got him playing safety. Jarek Reed can play all of those positions. He played outside corner a little bit at New Mexico. He can play all over the place. Julian Love has played outside corner, slot, both safety positions. They seem to be valuing those spots, guys that can play all those positions. Jonathan Sutherland has that unique Ryan Neal type skill set that does have a fit in this defense, but he's not going to be playing outside corner. He's probably not going to be playing nickel unless you got tight ends you're going against. He's going to be a big nickel. He's not going to be playing fast, quick, shifty receivers, and he's not going to be playing deep safety very often. Those just aren't strengths in his game. So, again, that's why Jarek Reed II made the most sense for me. But I definitely think there are more position groups on defense where you can look at a number of guys and say, you could make an argument for that guy being on the team. Offense, it felt more like, a lot of this is already set in stone. Defense, there's still a lot of questions. There's still some positions that are very much up for grabs going into the second preseason game. As always, you can follow me on Twitter, Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up on our Thursday show, going to be detailing observations from the final open training camp practice at the VMAC. I'm excited that I will be in attendance to give you some observations from that practice, and then going to be taking a look at what to watch on offense when the Seahawks battle the Cowboys at Lumen Field on Saturday. You won't want to miss it. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and thanks for listening. Go Hawks.